So this is an analysis video of Game 5 from the World Championship, and this is Caruana with white pieces and Magnus Carlsen with black. As in each of the games where Caruana has had white, the opening move has been e4. Caruana responds with c5, which is the Sicilian. Knight develops, and bishop to b5. This is the Rossolimo variation, which is the third time this has been seen in the World Championship. Each time that Caruana has had white pieces, he has gone for this particular position. In the first game, it led to him almost losing that game. The second time led to a fairly balanced position. Every game up to this point ended in a draw. So, although he was trying this particular opening for the third time, everybody was expecting him to throw something a bit different at Carlsen at some point. G6, castles, bishop to G7, E1, and here comes the surprising novelty from Caruana, B4. I should first mention the idea that Caruana had behind moving his rook to E1. He was essentially providing support for this pawn so that he could move it forward to the E5 square. Carlsen has shut that idea down by moving his pawn to E5, blockading this one. He does of course limit the range of his bishop here. It did have this nice long diagonal, and now of course it doesn't. So that's not exactly ideal for black, but it's better than allowing this pawn to be pushed forward, which would block the bishop anyway. And so b4 comes, which is basically just sacrificing a pawn, which Carlsen takes. And it's unusual for a player just to say, here's a free pawn, take it. But the idea is, by doing this, when Carlsen captures, he's opened up this b2 square for the dark squared bishop to come in and develop, which then attacks this pawn twice with the dark squared bishop and the knight when it's only defended once. If the pawn had been recaptured with this black pawn, then of course the knight remains here, giving two defenders on the pawn. So you might think the pawn's okay, but then the light squared bishop can capture, one of these pawns has to recapture, and then if the bishop's on b2, there's then two attackers and one defender again, and it's white to move. And this pawn then will fall. So it's a clever idea from Caruana. It gives him sort of initiative, development, and it's an idea that he feels gives him adequate compensation for that one pawn. The bishop comes to b2, and now the a6 pawn attacks the light squared bishop. The idea behind this really is that these two central pawns for Carlsen are quite weak. They're not defended as adequately as he would like, and obviously the best way to defend both of them simultaneously is to move this pawn forward to d6, protecting both of them. But at this point he can't do that because of this bishop on the light squared diagonal here, which pins this pawn to the king. What that means is you can never move yourself into check in chess. You can never move your king into danger. So it would be an illegal move for him to move this pawn at the moment. And the only way you can change that situation is by forcing this bishop away from this diagonal. So the pawn comes in to attack the bishop. If the bishop were to drop back to a4, pawn to b5 comes, and the bishop is trapped and is lost. So of course the only move for white is to retreat off this diagonal or counter-attack, which is what happens. Now the pawn comes to a3, now threatening a knight in turn, so if the capture on the bishop takes place, which it does, pawn recaptures, and now two rooks facing each other, that tension dissipates very quickly with a trade-off. And now the d6 move can finally be played, protecting these central pawns. Caruana then captures. A lesser player might just think, well, I move this pawn to d6 just so that if one of these pawns was taken, I could defend it and recapture. But of course, if he does recapture now, well, that's one pawn each traded off. But this pawn here is then left with one defender, the dark square bishop, and the two attackers, bishop and knight. So that would then fall on the next move. Carlsen, of course, doesn't fall into that trap and simply develops. Queen comes to e2, attacking the b5 pawn, which then moves forward onto b4. Queen to c4, attacking this pawn once again, developing the queen to a more of an active square as well. And then queen to a5. This is an interesting move because although this pawn is defended by the queen at this point, black adds an extra attacker onto this pawn, along with this pawn here, which creates a problem in itself, but it also adds defense to this b4 pawn, and it also attacks the bishop down on a1. So anytime you can make a move that achieves a few different things in one go, that's always advisable. The capture takes place. The bishop comes to e6. Of course, this pawn is starting to look dangerous. It's threatening the knight. It's advancing towards the end of the board. But bishop here, threatening the queen, forces white to get his queen out of the way, rather than considering any kind of pawn moves, really. I mean, white would like to really jump in here after capturing this, and the king recaptures. White could come in here, give check, start creating problems, take this pawn, if this a5 queen were to come down and capture the bishop. So by leaving this bishop here, white is essentially sort of baiting black into capturing it. If he were to do so, all sorts of problems would start to be created around this c7 square, potentially. The a5 queen for black doesn't move, but white goes ahead and plays queen to c7 anyway. This simply just trades off the queens and brings the pawn here over to c7, which is starting to look dangerous. It's only one square away from queening, but the issue is if it moves forward, this bishop can capture, this knight can capture straight away, and white has no pieces putting extra defense on this square here. With pawns, it's always a good idea when they're advanced to look for promising situations where you can keep pushing them forward to the next square. But there is a point where you have to be careful, because if you push it too far into a position where it's undefendable, then you end up losing the pawn, and all the kind of problems you're creating for the other person by having that advanced pawn then just evaporate. Knight comes to c6, c3 is played, king to d7, now looking to just hoover up this pawn. Captures. Now rook to a8, which threatens the a1 bishop. And the bishop comes to c3, giving extra defense to this pawn which is under attack, and also getting itself out of danger. The capture takes place, and pawn to d3. Now the king comes to b6, which was one of the two main moves in this position. The other one was to just move the pawn here to b5, blockading this pawn here. One of the weaknesses in white's position here is that his two knights, it's very difficult. It would take a few moves for them to actually be able to get over and protect this pawn. So it's only protected once at the moment, which means that if this pawn had come forward to b5, this white pawn is blockaded, then, I mean, it's already attacked once, but then you can start to look for rook down to a4 or bishop over to f8 to add extra attackers on the pawn, and the pawn just isn't defendable in that situation. Carlsen goes for king to b6. I guess he's trying to get his king more active in the centre of the board and feels that the king ends up coming over and winning this pawn anyway. So that was his idea. Bishop drops back. To d8. Check. Now the king comes forward thinking, okay, I'm just going to take this pawn. But black clearly hasn't calculated as far as Caruana has with white here. Check. There's a capture. And now the knight moves to d5, giving check, and once the exchange happens, this rook comes over to b1, giving check to the king, driving it away, and winning the b7 pawn. So in actual fact, what seemed to be a free pawn for black actually turns out not to be at all, because further on in the sequence of moves there is a forced capture of this pawn on b7 if black uses the king to come in and try and capture this pawn. If he had chosen the move which the computer says is slightly better, pawn to b5 to blockade it first, then perhaps things are different. So the threat that the rook has here on b7 is that it's now threatening this pawn here, and if this pawn moves out the way, the bishop goes, so the pawn is pinned to the bishop, and so it's pretty uncomfortable for black. His way to immediately solve the problem is to go knight to d8, protecting this pawn here and attacking the rook simultaneously. And for now that's enough to alleviate the pressure a little bit. Check comes in with the rook, a pawn is captured, and king to f1. Mostly this seems to be just a safety move really, because if this king does move out the way, this rook can then come down and start giving check and stuff like that. Whereas if it's in this position, then the knight can block. If the rook captures, the king recaptures. Yeah, perhaps that's the reason why. And pawn to h5, pawn to h3, probably giving the king a little route to be able to escape out the back door if check is given on the first rank. King to e4. And now we see the problem with this knight on d8 defending this pawn. It's a temporary measure, but this knight is eventually coming to here, and in this instance it gives check to the king, which means that this pawn is just always going. King has to move, there's the capture, and if the knight were to recapture, the rook would recapture, and white's just up a pawn. The game continued for a little while after this. The exchange does take place, check, blocked by the bishop, then check, and then the draw was offered and accepted. So there were a number of interesting points in this game where the players made either unusual moves or slightly inaccurate moves. Both players had chances to create something a little more than what they ended up with, which was, you know, a very kind of drawn position, 3 pawns each, a bishop and a rook. But overall it was an interesting game, probably more interesting than the previous two. And after this game, Carlsen will have white pieces 2 games in a row. So I may do another analysis video of one of those if it proves to be exciting.